Every quilt is made up of 3 distinct layers. A quilt back, which is what it sounds like. It is the reverse of the quilt. Quilt batting, the fluffy layer in the middle that gives the quilt its loft and warmth. And the quilt top, which is the combination of all the patchwork, any borders, any other element of the design that makes the quilt as we think of it, the patchwork part. That's what we're putting together in this episode of How to Quilt. Now that you've finished all 12 of the How to Quilt video series sampler quilt blocks, we're ready to assemble those into the quilt top. Now, each of our blocks measures 12.5 inches before we put them all together into this quilt top. So it's very difficult for me to get all of that into one video shot for you, so I've made like a little tiny version that I'm going to demonstrate on my cutting table so you can see what we're talking about. Now here we are, here are all our little blocks. Isn't that fun? Made them on paper so that we can talk about sashing and borders. Each of our blocks is 12.5 inches. And when we put them all together, if we did, 2 of the same block edge to edge, we could just stitch them together and then you get a repeating pattern of that particular block. Sometimes a repeating pattern can create secondary patterns that you didn't expect. But in a sampler quilt like this, it is much more common to divide your blocks from one another with the same fabric in each division, as if you're looking through a window and each of these is a pane of glass, stained glass in this case. These divisions, those small pieces, are called sashing. And then fabric that goes around the entire perimeter is a border. You should know that borders and sashing are totally optional and don't appear in every quilt. Sometimes the visual impact of a particular quilt block is in its repetition. And so rather than separating each block with the sashing that we're looking at, we'll stitch the quilt blocks directly to one another and they'll be neighbors. Sashing, however, it's like a window pane. That's why we call it sashing. It is the edging in between the individual blocks that highlights them. So in a sampler quilt like this one, where none of the blocks is identical to its neighbor, the sashing creates just enough of a buffer, a little negative space between the designs of the blocks to allow each of them to stand out on their own. So in our sashing here, we have corner pieces. These are squares. And then we have a sashing edge that is the same size as each of our blocks. And when you've done this a few times, you start to recognize how that happens, how those blocks are assembled with the sashing. But I've gone ahead and broken it apart so it's super clear. So we've got block, sashing, block, sashing, block, sashing, block with no sashing. So these guys get connected. And then we've got block sashing, sashing square, and those guys get connected. Right, so this is 12.5 inches, this is 12.5 inches. The sashing is 12.5 inches, and the square is 3.5 inches. So all of these combined will fit together into a little unit. This is connected, these two are connected, and now these two can go together to make a unit that looks like this. So as I connect each segment, so sashing, square plus sashing, sashing, square, eventually I'm going to get columns like this, and I can connect column to column to column sequentially across. Could I also do block, sashing, block, sashing, block? And then sashing, square, sashing, and do rows across? Of course you can. Why not? Any way you want. The idea, however, is that we're building portions of the quilt and then bringing them together as if it's a really big block. This kind of repetition of geometry should be very familiar to you. It's just a different scale. Quiz time. What else would you want to be doing when you are connecting a column to its neighboring column regarding these seams here? If you said matching and nesting your seams, good for you. As we've gone through the How to Quilt video series, each of those skills was intentionally designed to build upon itself over time so that we get to this place where we're assembling this entire quilt top. So, what if you want a smaller quilt and you don't want to do the sashing? Well, then don't do the sashing. Put your blocks together, right? Why not? Do it any way you want. You can do your blocks together with a border or without a border. What if you want the sashing and it's still not big enough? Make a border. The border is anything that goes around the edge of the quilt in order to give it sometimes just extra inches, can make the body of the quilt bigger. For the purposes of the How to Quilt video series sampler quilt, you don't have to do the border. I've included flying geese in the border design here. You can eliminate those and still do the border. You can do no border at all if you'd like a slightly smaller quilt, like a lap size, or you can do multiple borders. Anytime you choose to do a border, it is very simply a strip of fabric, the same width all the way around the body of the quilt, that gives you an opportunity to both add color, to expand the size of the quilt, and to explore fabric and print. Sometimes it's just the little edge that brings the whole thing together. In our finished design, there's a flying geese border, which is very simply stacks of flying geese connected to a same width strip of fabric that goes all the way around the perimeter of our quilt. What if you do the sashing and the border and it's still not big enough? Add another border, add another. You can keep going and make it as big or as small as you want. You can make just one block of this sampler quilt and quilt it and bind it and have a tiny little quilt the size of a pot holder, if that's what you actually want. The idea here is that by adding in sashing, visually we are separating the design of the blocks from one another, and then we're creating a greater measurement for the quilt as a whole so that it's big enough to cover a bed. If you build out your How to Quilt sampler quilt using the measurements provided, including the sashing and the borders, it comes to about 60 inches by 72 inches, which is approximately a twin size quilt. It's a little smaller, but not by much. It will absolutely fit on a twin size bed beautifully. And there it is. The next step for making our sampler quilt will be to do the actual quilting stitches. And if you're not quite ready to do that yet, and a lot of quilters finish the patchwork and make the quilt top and take a break, there's always another delicious design out there calling to us. If you are one of those, you can hang your quilt top up over a pants hanger or with a skirt hanger to keep it nice and flat and pressed until you are ready to move on. For those of you who are ready to move on right now, we're going to build the quilt sandwich in the next episode of How to Quilt.